Watch the sequence of this footage carefully, because the order it happened in is the entire story. First, the flash of impact at a base in Jordan, an Iranian ballistic missile finding its mark against American forces for the first time in months. Then, less than 24 hours later, the sky over Bandar Abbas, over Tehran, over coastal facilities that Iran spent years building, lighting up under a wave of American air power unlike anything seen in this campaign so far. Bunker buster bombs punching into ballistic missile infrastructure, coastal surveillance sites erased, and for the first time in 8 consecutive nights of strikes, a single phrase appearing in the official language coming out of Washington that had never been used before in this entire war. Swiftly punish, not degrade, not disrupt. Punish. That is not a press release anymore. That is a message, and it was delivered in the exact currency the people who ordered the attack on American troops understand best. Consider what it actually takes for a military campaign to shift its language this abruptly, because that shift is not a small thing inside a bureaucracy built around careful, measured public statements. For 8 straight nights, American strikes on Iran had been described in the clinical vocabulary typical of a sustained degradation campaign: target serviced, capability reduced, infrastructure disabled. That is the language of an air force checking boxes on a target list. Punishment is a different word entirely, carrying a different legal and political weight, because it explicitly frames the strike as retribution for a specific act, rather than continuation of a broader strategic objective. Militaries do not reach for that word casually, and when it appears for the first time after 8 nights of otherwise consistent messaging, it tells you the personnel making decisions inside that command structure experienced this attack differently than every strike that came before it. Something crossed a line internally, not just publicly. But let's back all the way up. Because to understand why that specific language mattered so much, you need to understand what had been building for months before it. This war traces back to the 28th of February, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iran that killed its supreme leader in the opening hours. What followed was a war of fits and starts, campaigns that paused, memorandums that were signed with 60-day windows meant to produce a permanent end to the fighting, and Iranian actions in the Strait of Hormuz that kept reigniting hostilities before those windows ever closed. By the time this latest phase of the campaign began, American strikes on Iran had already resumed for a full week, night after night, hitting missile storage, drone facilities, and naval infrastructure with a level of intensity clearly designed to force Tehran back toward the negotiating table it kept claiming to still believe in. And then, on the night of the 17th, Iran answered that pressure the only way it apparently knew how, not with a phone call, with ballistic missiles aimed directly at American forces stationed in Jordan. The 60-day memorandum deserves its own moment of scrutiny here, because its collapse is the direct thread connecting the diplomatic failure to the missiles that hit Jordan. That framework was built specifically to give both governments a fixed runway toward a permanent settlement, structured time meant to move past the cycle of temporary ceasefires that had already failed once before in April. Instead of holding, Iran's continued military activity around the Strait of Hormuz effectively voided that window before it ever had the chance to demonstrate whether 60 days of structured diplomacy could actually produce something durable. That is the pattern worth remembering every time a new framework gets announced in this conflict. It is not that Iran refuses to sign agreements. It has signed several. It is that the terms of those agreements keep getting treated as suggestions, rather than binding commitments the moment they conflict with whatever the Revolutionary Guard's regional strategy currently requires. Now, let's talk about exactly what happened at that base, because the specific details matter more than the vague summary. Iranian ballistic missiles struck Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, a facility that hosts American troops and fighter aircraft, in a strike that United States Central Command confirmed killed American service members while partner forces defended against the incoming missile and drone attack. 2 service members were confirmed killed almost immediately. A third was reported missing. 4 additional troops were wounded seriously enough to require medical evacuation to Jordanian hospitals, later discharged after treatment, while several others were evaluated for minor injuries and returned to duty. In the hours that followed, American forces located additional remains in Jordan, ultimately raising the confirmed death toll connected to that single strike, and pushing the cumulative number of American service members killed since this war began to 16. Read that number again, because it is the marker every escalation in this conflict gets measured against from this point forward. 16 Americans dead since February, most of them lost in the opening days of the war, and these the first direct combat fatalities since fighting resumed weeks earlier. The quiet that had settled over American casualties in this war ended on the 17th of July, and it ended violently. The name of that base matters more than most viewers realize, because Muwafaq Salti has functioned as one of the most important American forward operating locations in the entire region throughout this conflict, hosting fighter jets and support personnel central to the broader air campaign against Iran. Striking that specific facility was not a random act of retaliation against an undefended target. It required Iran to identify, track, and successfully target a hardened, actively defended American installation with enough precision that at least some portion of the incoming barrage evaded interception entirely, a capability gap that deserves real scrutiny given how consistently American and Allied air defenses have intercepted Iranian projectiles throughout the rest of this war. Something about this specific strike, whether the number of missiles launched simultaneously, the angle of approach, or simply the element of surprise after weeks without a successful hit, allowed at least part of that barrage through. Understanding exactly what allowed that gap to open is likely already the subject of an urgent internal review inside the Pentagon, because whatever vulnerability enabled it needs to be closed before Iran identifies it as a repeatable tactic, rather than a single fortunate strike. Let's dissect exactly what the American response looked like, because the language used to describe it was deliberately, unmistakably different from every strike that came before it. United States Central Command announced that American forces began a new wave of airstrikes at 6 in the evening Eastern Time, directed personally by the Commander-in-Chief, explicitly designed to further degrade Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz and to swiftly punish the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps forces responsible for the attack in Jordan. Read that phrase again, because in 8 consecutive nights of strikes against Iran, this was the first time American officials had explicitly named the Revolutionary Guard as the direct target of retaliatory action, rather than describing the campaign in the broader language of degrading capability. That shift from institutional to personal is not accidental phrasing. It reflects exactly how the American military and the American public tend to process the loss of service members in combat. When your own are targeted and killed, the mission does not change in substance, but the language around it changes completely. Because everyone involved now understands precisely who gave the order that killed those 2 soldiers, and precisely who is being punished for it. Here is where the contrast between Iran's public rhetoric and the reality on the ground becomes impossible to ignore. In the aftermath of the Jordan strike, Iran's government escalated its public statements dramatically, with its supreme leader accusing the United States of repeated breaches of the agreement between the 2 countries, and warning that America would face what he described as unforgettable lessons. Separately, a senior Iranian military figure, Major General Mohsen Rezaieh, threatened that Tehran was prepared to resume full-scale offensive operations if American strikes continued for another 2 or 3 days, and Iranian officials publicly claimed that a significant portion of the country's military capability had not yet even been used, suggesting further escalation could open entirely new fronts in the conflict. Read that claim carefully, because it deserves scrutiny rather than automatic acceptance. A government whose ballistic missile forces have just been reduced to launching a single successful strike after months of sustained American bombing does not typically describe itself as holding back reserves of undisclosed strength. That is the language of a government trying to manufacture leverage through implied threat rather than demonstrated capability, precisely because demonstrated capability is the one thing this war has made increasingly difficult for Iran to produce. There is also a separate, quieter dispute worth acknowledging here, because it illustrates exactly how each side frames identical events for entirely different audiences. Iran has characterized certain incidents involving commercial shipping in the Gulf as safety measures gone wrong, describing mines and other hazards as protective steps meant to warn vessels away from contested waters, rather than deliberate attacks. Independent assessments of these incidents have frequently reached very different conclusions, treating them as deliberate strikes dressed up in the language of caution after the fact. That framing gap is not a minor rhetorical quirk. It is a consistent pattern running through nearly every disputed incident in this war, where an action with real casualties gets recast publicly as an unfortunate byproduct of legitimate defensive measures. Whether that reflects genuine confusion inside Iran's own command structure about what its forces are actually doing in real time, or a deliberate strategy of plausible deniability built into every operation from the outset, the practical effect on outside observers is the same. Nearly every claim coming out of Tehran now requires independent verification before it can be treated as reliable, a credibility deficit the regime has built for itself through months of exactly this kind of contradictory messaging. Now, let's get into the mechanics of how that 8th night of strikes was actually carried out, because the hardware combination involved represents one of the more sophisticated strike packages of this entire campaign. Reporting and imagery from the period point to a 3-aircraft team working in close coordination, the EA-18G Growler, the F-16, and the B-52H Stratofortress, each handling a distinct role inside the same mission. The Growler flies first, because nothing else in this package functions without it. Built from the airframe of the F-A-18F Super Hornet, and outfitted with an ALQ-99 jamming system alongside AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles, its job is to blind Iran's integrated air defense network before anything else arrives. When Iranian radar operators attempt to track the incoming strike package, the Growler either floods those frequencies with electronic noise until the operator's screen goes white, or rides the radar emission directly back to its source and eliminates the site with an anti-radiation missile. By the time the rest of the package reaches its targets, Iran's radar picture has effectively collapsed into static. Behind that electronic corridor comes the F-16, the precision workhorse of this entire campaign, using its onboard radar and GPS-guided JDAM munitions to deliver point-accuracy strikes against high-value targets like IRGC headquarters buildings, coastal radar nodes, and surveillance installations that require pinpoint accuracy rather than broad area effect. And behind both of them, operating from well outside the range of Iran's remaining air defenses, comes the B-52H Stratofortress, a bomber that has been in continuous service since 1961 and has been confirmed operating in this campaign since its opening weeks, carrying AGM-158 JASSM and JSSM-ER standoff cruise missiles capable of striking targets from well over 500 miles away. That range is the entire point. The B-52 does not need to enter contested Iranian airspace to deliver its payload. It can orbit safely outside the threat envelope, release its missiles, and let the JASSM-ER's own guidance system fly the dangerous final approach at low altitude while the bomber turns for home. Iran's air defense network, already degraded across 7 prior nights of strikes, was never designed to track more than a dozen cruise missiles converging on multiple targets simultaneously from a launch platform it likely never even detected. The strategic logic behind pairing a decades-old bomber with modern standoff missiles rather than retiring the platform entirely deserves a moment of its own, because it explains a great deal about how this entire air campaign has been structured from the beginning. The B-52 entered service 7 years before Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was even founded, and yet it remains flying today specifically because the airframe itself was never really the valuable part of the equation. What matters is payload capacity and endurance, the ability to carry up to 70,000 pounds of mixed ordnance, and remain airborne for the better part of a day with aerial refueling support. Pair that airframe with modern precision-guided standoff weapons capable of striking from hundreds of miles away, and you get a platform that never has to expose itself to the exact air defense systems it is being used to defeat. That combination, old airframe, new weapons, has effectively let the United States sidestep the entire question of whether a 70-year-old bomber can survive modern Iranian air defenses, because the answer this campaign has settled on is that it never has to find out. The electronic warfare dimension of this specific strike package is worth returning to as well, because it represents a doctrine that has been refined specifically for exactly this kind of degraded but not fully eliminated air defense environment. Iran's integrated air defense system, built around a mix of older Russian-derived systems and domestically produced platforms, was never designed to counter a coordinated jamming and precision strike package operating with this level of sophistication. The Growler's dual capability, the ability to either blind a radar site electronically or physically destroy it with an anti-radiation missile depending on the tactical situation, forces Iranian air defense operators into an impossible choice every time they attempt to bring a system online. Leave the radar off, and the incoming strike package proceeds completely undetected. Turn it on to track the threat, and that same radar emission becomes the beacon that guides a missile directly back to its source. That dilemma, more than any single weapon in this strike package, is what has allowed American and Allied air power to operate with increasing freedom over Iranian territory, as this campaign has progressed. So, what does the confirmed operational picture look like once you put hard numbers against all of this? 16 American service members killed since this war began in February, with the most recent losses marking the first direct combat fatalities in months. 4 additional troops wounded and evacuated in the Jordan strike alone. 8 consecutive nights of American strikes against Iran, hitting targets stretching from Bandar Abbas in the south to Tehran itself, with coastal surveillance facilities, ballistic missile infrastructure, air defense sites, and now explicitly named Revolutionary Guard forces all absorbing direct hits. Iran, in turn, launched additional ballistic missiles toward Jordan the following day, missiles that were intercepted by Israeli air defenses, with debris from that intercept falling inside Israeli territory itself, a detail that raises real questions about whether Iran is deliberately testing how close it can push toward drawing Israel more directly into this specific exchange. Kuwait reported that a power and desalination plant, a facility critical to the region's water supply, was struck by Iranian attacks for the second time in 2 days, and Iran publicly floated the idea of a ground campaign aimed at seizing American military bases inside Kuwait, a threat that would require an amphibious or airborne capability Iran has shown no evidence of possessing at any point in this entire war, given that it currently lacks the air superiority such an operation would demand to survive first contact. The debris falling inside Israeli territory deserves particular attention as its own data point. separate from the broader casualty and strike numbers, because it represents a category of escalation risk this war had mostly avoided until now. Israel has participated in the broader campaign against Iran since its opening hours, but the fighting on Israeli soil itself has remained comparatively limited compared to the sustained exchanges happening across Jordan, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf more broadly. Intercepted missile debris landing inside Israeli territory, even without direct casualties or significant damage, changes the calculation for Israeli decision-makers who have so far allowed the United States to carry the majority of the direct strike burden against Iran. Every additional incident of that kind increases domestic political pressure inside Israel to respond more directly rather than continuing to operate primarily in a supporting role. And a more directly engaged Israel introduces an entirely different set of military options and escalation risks than the ones currently shaping American and Saudi decision-making in this conflict. That brings us to the three pressure tracks converging on this exact moment, because none of them can be separated from the other two. The first track is direct military retaliation, an escalation ladder where American casualties now draw an explicitly named, explicitly personal response against the Revolutionary Guard rather than a diffuse campaign against Iranian military capability in general. The second track is psychological, playing out through Iran's own public statements, warnings of unforgettable lessons, threats of full-scale offensive operations, and claims of undisclosed reserve capability, all of it aimed less at deterring further American strikes, and more at reassuring a domestic and regional audience that the regime retains options, even as its actual demonstrated capability continues shrinking with each passing night. And the third track is diplomatic collapse, the unraveling of a memorandum that was supposed to give both sides 60 days to negotiate a permanent end to hostilities, undone specifically by Iran's continued military actions around the Strait of Hormuz, well before that window ever had a chance to run its course. All three tracks intersected in the same 72-hour window. Missiles striking Jordan, explicit punishment strikes striking Iran, and a diplomatic framework that was already effectively dead before the ink had time to matter. What makes this particular convergence different from earlier moments in the war is the compression of the timeline itself. Previous escalation cycles in this conflict tended to unfold over the course of a week or more, an attack, followed by days of deliberation, followed eventually by a calibrated response. This cycle collapsed that entire process into roughly 24 hours. Missiles hitting Jordan on the 17th, and American punishment strikes explicitly naming the IRGC as a target that same night into the 18th. That acceleration reflects a military and political apparatus that has had months to build standing response plans for exactly this scenario, American casualties from a direct Iranian strike, and simply had to execute a plan already sitting ready rather than build one from scratch under pressure. The speed of that response is itself a form of signaling, telling Tehran that any future attack resulting in American deaths will be met with a response measured in hours rather than days, removing whatever strategic window Iran might have hoped to exploit between an attack and the retaliation that follows it. Now let's go inside the actual leadership structure making these decisions, because there is a detail here worth sitting with carefully. Several of the figures currently occupying senior civilian government positions in Iran built their entire careers inside the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, before transitioning into the formal government roles they hold today. That matters enormously for understanding why the line between Iran's political leadership and its military command structure functions less like a boundary and more like a revolving door. When American officials describe swiftly punishing the IRGC forces responsible for an attack, they are not describing a rogue faction operating outside the government's control. They are describing the same institutional pipeline that produced much of the country's current civilian leadership in the first place. That overlap explains why accusations of an American treaty violation issued directly through the Supreme Leader's own public statements can be delivered in the same voice and through the same institutional apparatus that ordered ballistic missiles fired at a base full of American service members days earlier. There is no meaningful separation here between the diplomatic voice claiming victimhood and the military voice ordering the attack that provoked the retaliation in the first place. This structural overlap has direct consequences for how any future de-escalation attempt has to be evaluated going forward. When a government's diplomatic and military wings are staffed by people who move through the same institutional pipeline and share the same foundational loyalty to the Revolutionary Guard's broader strategic objectives, a promise made at the negotiating table carries less independent weight than it would in a government with genuine separation between its civilian and military leadership. It means the question worth asking after any future ceasefire announcement is not simply whether Iran's negotiators are acting in good faith, but whether the entire government structure they operate within is even capable of producing an agreement that binds the military establishment the same way it binds the diplomats who signed it. Based on the pattern established by the April ceasefire, the June memorandum, and now this latest breakdown, the honest answer so far has been no, not reliably, and not for more than a matter of weeks at a time. So what is the honest strategic assessment sitting underneath all of this? Iran's public rhetoric has escalated sharply. Threats of full-scale offensive operations, warnings of unforgettable lessons, claims of untapped military reserves, and even talk of a ground invasion into a Gulf state hosting American forces. But the actual demonstrated capability behind that rhetoric tells a very different story. A single successful ballistic missile strike after months of sustained American bombing, followed immediately by additional missile launches that were intercepted before reaching their targets, describes a military running low on both platforms and options, not a military holding significant reserves in wait. The gap between what Iran is threatening publicly and what it has actually been able to accomplish militarily over the past week is now wide enough that treating every new statement out of Tehran as a credible operational threat risks badly misreading where this conflict actually stands. That does not mean the threats are meaningless. A regime cornered militarily and desperate to project strength domestically has historically proven capable of taking actions that make little strategic sense on paper, precisely because the alternative, appearing powerless in front of its own population, carries a political cost its leadership may consider even worse. That domestic political dimension is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as background noise, because a regime that has spent months absorbing sustained bombardment while publicly insisting it retains overwhelming strength cannot simply abandon that narrative overnight without risking real consequences at home. Every night of American strikes that goes unanswered or answered only weakly chips away at whatever domestic legitimacy the current leadership structure has left, particularly among the hardline factions inside the Revolutionary Guard who built their entire political identity around projecting strength against exactly this kind of external pressure. That internal audience matters just as much as the external one Washington is trying to influence, and it explains why Iran's public statements have grown more extreme, even as its actual military options have grown more limited. The louder the rhetoric gets, the more it should be read as evidence of shrinking room to maneuver rather than genuine reserve strength being held in wait, a pattern consistent with how cornered governments have behaved in past conflicts long before this one began. And here is the structural risk that deserves more attention than any single night of strikes, because it is the detail most likely to determine how far this specific escalation actually goes. American aerial refueling tankers have been repositioned deeper into the theater, moved specifically to extend the operational reach of strike aircraft that would otherwise be limited by range. That repositioning matters because it is not just B-52s and F-16s that benefit from tankers moving closer to the fight. The B-2 Spirit, the only aircraft in the American inventory capable of carrying the massive ordnance penetrator, also depends entirely on aerial refueling to reach targets from its home bases, and its presence has already been discussed publicly in connection with a specific hardened facility Iran has spent months excavating. If that repositioning is in fact laying the groundwork for a B-2 mission rather than simply sustaining the current pace of B-52 and fighter operations, the next chapter of this war could look considerably different from the 8 nights that preceded it. Debris from an intercepted missile already fell inside Israeli territory this week. Kuwait has now been struck twice in 2 days, and Iran is publicly floating the idea of a ground campaign it almost certainly cannot execute. Every one of those details individually looks like posturing. Taken together, they describe a conflict where the margin for a miscalculation serious enough to pull in additional countries directly is shrinking fast. The hardened facility referenced in connection with a possible B-2 mission has been discussed publicly by American officials for weeks now, described as a site Iran has been actively excavating specifically to survive the kind of weapon that already hit its predecessor nuclear sites earlier in this war. Whether the current tanker repositioning is actually connected to preparations for a strike on that facility, or simply reflects the logistical demands of sustaining the current tempo of B-52 and fighter operations across multiple nightly strike packages, is not something that can be confirmed from outside the Pentagon's own planning process. What can be said with confidence is that the infrastructure now being put in place, extended refueling range, sustained bomber operations, explicit retaliatory strikes against the IRGC by name, all points toward an American posture that is expanding rather than contracting, even as diplomatic language from both governments continues to reference the possibility of a negotiated path forward. Those two trends, expanding military posture and continued diplomatic references, are not necessarily contradictory, but they do describe a war that is becoming simultaneously more dangerous and more diplomatically active at the exact same time, a combination that has defined nearly every phase of this conflict since it began in February. Which brings this back to where it started, the order of that footage mattering more than any single frame inside it. First, American blood spilled at a base in Jordan. 2 service members killed, a 3rd missing. The war's quiet stretch of American casualties ending in the worst possible way. Then, within hours, American airpower answering with a specificity this campaign had never used before. Punishment named explicitly, IRGC forces targeted explicitly, a message delivered in exactly the currency Tehran's leadership understands. Iran's public response has been loud. Threats of unforgettable lessons, warnings of full-scale offensive operations, talk of invading a Gulf ally outright. Its actual battlefield response has been a single missile barrage that killed American troops once and failed every time since. 16 Americans are dead in this war. Whether the next chapter brings a negotiated de-escalation or a strike on a mountain, Washington has been watching for months, depends entirely on which of those two Irans, the one making threats or the one that keeps failing to back them up, actually holds the real power inside Tehran's command structure right now. What remains unresolved tonight is the same question that has followed this war since its opening hours: whether a regime built on the fusion of its military and political leadership can actually be deterred through punishment alone, or whether every strike against the Revolutionary Guard simply reinforces the exact narrative of external aggression that leadership has used to justify its own survival for decades. The missiles that hit Jordan proved Iran retains the capability to draw American blood when it chooses to spend the resources required. The nights of strikes that followed proved the United States retains the capability to answer that choice with overwhelming and increasingly precise force. Neither of those facts, on its own, answers the only question that actually matters going forward: whether either side is prepared to accept the other's terms before this pattern repeats itself again. Until that answer arrives, the fighter jets stay armed, the tankers stay repositioned closer to the fight, and the ninth night of strikes is already being planned before the eighth has even finished making headlines.